What if a single sheet of paper, folded in half and tucked into a backpack, could turn a life of rejection into a first million? At 12 years old, Ava Thompson sat at the edge of a narrow bed in a foster home that never quite felt like hers, and wrote a letter to her future self. 3 short lines that would become a blueprint for a comeback story most people would call impossible. Have you ever been through this? Staring down a version of your life that seems already decided, wondering if there's any sentence you could write that might break the script? Stay with me till the end, because what you're about to discover might surprise you. The room was quiet except for the scratch of a pencil and the hum of a streetlight outside. She wasn't writing a wish list or a diary entry. She was writing terms. A pact. Words chosen the way you choose stepping stones in a river, careful and deliberate. Ava wasn't a child of lucky breaks. She was a child of case numbers and changing zip codes, of bags packed fast and names spoken softly so they wouldn't echo. But that night, the 12-year-old who'd been told she didn't belong anywhere made a promise to someone who still could, her future self. At 12, Ava folded a single page and slid it into her backpack. Years later, that page would pay for her future. This isn't a fairy tale. It's an emotional story about resilience and the cost of being underestimated, not just by strangers, but by the people who should have believed in you first. Ava's path from orphan and overlooked to self-made millionaire didn't start with money. It started with language. 3 clear promises that turned heartbreak into discipline, chaos into routine, and fear into fuel. If you've ever been rejected by family, if you felt like your last name didn't open doors but close them, you'll recognize the rhythm of her beginning. Early mornings, tight budgets, a backpack with more paper than plans. You'll recognize the sting and the stubborn courage that follows it. The letter wasn't magic, but it gave structure to something stronger than luck. Consistency. It taught her to reread instead of rewrite her value, to show up before the sun, and to study longer than the noise could last. It nudged her toward small, testable steps, odd jobs, library hours, scribbled ideas that quietly compound over time. It turned someday into a calendar and maybe into metrics. This is how a rejected kid becomes a resilient adult, how an abandoned story becomes a viral comeback. This is how an orphan to millionaire narrative stops being a headline and starts being a plan. Ava's transformation wasn't about pretending the pain didn't happen. It was about naming it and refusing to let it be the ending. She didn't run from the label. She rewrote what it meant. She learned to place one practical action between every emotion and every decision, to convert anger into focus, and trade the glow of short-term validation for quiet power of long-term results. She learned to measure progress by pages read, calls made, and doors knocked, not by applause. Have you ever been through this? Doing the right things when no one is watching, betting on your future with nothing but your own proof? Her first win was small, almost invisible, a low-cost idea, a modest sale, but it was a crack of light in a room that had been dark for years. She taped a copy of the letter inside a notebook, not to romanticize the struggle, but to remember the contract. Stay with me till the end, because the line she circled that night is the same one she would credit years later, when a bank account finally reflected the life she had been building in silence. Before we unfold that first promise, let me ask you something personal. If a single page could shift your story, what would you write to your future self right now? If any part of Ava's beginning echoes your own, foster homes, closed doors, or just the quiet work of showing up, add your voice below. Tell us what hit you hardest or what you wish someone had told you at 12. Your words might be the line a stranger needs to read tonight. And if this is resonating, tap like, not for vanity, but because it signals to the platform that stories of resilience matter, pushing this video towards someone who's still stuck in the dark part of their timeline. If you want to keep walking with us through these emotional stories and real comebacks, subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. That simple act helps this channel stay alive, funds better research, and keeps this message reaching the people who need it most. Think of it as joining a community that refuses to let rejection have the last word. If this makes sense to you, drop a comment with a line you'd send to your younger self. Hit like to carry this further, and subscribe to stand with us in the long game. Now, hold that thought, because the first promise inside Ava's letter isn't just a rule, it's a rhythm. And once you hear it, you may start to hear in your own day. She learned early that sometimes silence speaks louder than any goodbye. In the spaces between placements, Ava would count by door frames and kitchen tiles, because numbers didn't move when people did. Caseworkers change, addresses change. Even the last name on her school file changed. The only constant was a black backpack with a single sheet of paper hidden inside it, folded along a crease so sharp it felt like a promise. Foster care had its own weather. Sudden storms, brief calms, and long stretches of gray where no one said a word forever out loud. She understood the choreography. Trash bags or packing, a quick tour of new rules, a careful smile for strangers who might become family for a month. Belonging was a room she visited, not a place she kept a key to. When night fell, the house of familiar sounds that weren't hers, a refrigerator's hum, a hallway clock, footsteps that slowed outside her door. In that limbo, she began to treat routine like a railing. Wait before the sun. Read what she could borrow. Reread the letter. Place one steady action between every emotion and every decision. Ava wasn't cataloging pain. She was building a language to survive it. She could feel the difference between pity and patience, between being seen and being watched. When a teacher asked where home was, she learned to answer with a subject she loved instead, math, because equations stayed put. In the library, she discovered a quiet that didn't feel like a threat. Shelves didn't ask questions. Paper didn't tattle. She traced a grain of tables worn smooth by other hands and thought about all the rise stories, the emotional stories, the inspiring stories tucked behind plain covers. Not fairy tales, blueprints. She'd open biographies and look for the first decision that broke the chain. A letter, a mentor, a habit. This was her real-life inspiration. Not because it wrapped the hard parts in ribbon, but because it put the hard parts to work. There on a page, she met true stories of perseverance that didn't begin with wealth or luck. They began with a moment like hers. One person, one sentence, one room where no one clapped. When she moved again, the backpack came first into the new room and last out. The letter's edge was softening from being pulled and refolded. But the ink had gained weight in her mind. She started noticing the architecture of days, a hallway that led to a bus stop, a bus that always paused at the same intersection, sunlight that reached a certain shelf by late afternoon. She arranged her life along those fixed points, because structure was the closest thing to ownership, and she began to track tiny results the way some people track weather. Pages read, vocabulary words collected, minutes of focused study. It wasn't glamorous, and that helped. Glamour felt like a shortcut, and shortcuts felt like traps. In a world that too easily confuses attention with affection, she learned to prefer the quiet wins that no one could take back. The letter asked for that kind of win. It asked for hours no one saw. She would sometimes test herself in small, ordinary ways. Could she hold eye contact in a meeting with an adult without apologizing? Could she ask for a library extension without shrinking? These weren't dramatic scenes you find in motivational stories. They were everyday rehearsals for a life where she would have to speak up and sign her own forms. She was cautious with hope. When you live by other people's calendars, even dreaming can feel like theft. But patterns have a way of whispering the future, and Ava began to hear one forming. Effort, rest, repeat. That rhythm became her shelter. When reports came back with praise, she marked the praise. Then she marked the practice that led to it. When reports came back with nothing, she marked the practice anyway. The work had to matter even when the room was empty. Every new house meant relearning how to enter a kitchen, how to ask for what was already offered, how to make space without disappearing. Some evenings, a foster parent would stand in the doorway and ask about school, and Ava would answer with specifics because specifics sounded like stability. She learned to notice which adults cared about process and which cared about performance. She quietly followed the ones who asked better questions. In that quiet, something calibrated. She wasn't collecting gold stars. She was collecting proof. It's a foundation you don't see in stories of resilience. The scaffolding beneath success after rejection. The headline, orphan to millionaire, misses the hours spent choosing a book over a screen, a walk over an argument, a list over a spiral. It misses the dozens of small refusals that cut new paths through the day. Now, I want to go even deeper into this. She began to understand belonging not as a gift someone gives, But as a practice, she could build. If no place felt like hers, then discipline could be her address. If no last name opened doors, then competence could. She mapped her sense of self to actions that didn't depend on permission. A morning routine before the house woke, a set of questions for each new class, a way to take notes that made the world she wanted feel closer. And because she knew rejection by its temperature, she learned to stand near it without freezing. She could look at a closed door and think, not this one, not now, but look how many hinges there are on this street. That's what stories of overcoming rejection rarely show. The practice neutrality that lets you try the next handle. The letter sat at the center of this practice like a compass. She didn't worship it. She used it. Each sentence was a hinge she could swing her day on. And as the months layered, the quiet fidelity to those lines created a kind of gravity. Opportunities began to drift her way, not because luck had changed, but because she had become easier to find. As she took small risks, the world offered slightly larger ones. A chance to present a project, a neighbor who needed help and paid for it, a teacher who recommended a local program. Nothing felt like a miracle. Everything felt like a continuation. That's the hidden geometry in inspiring stories and success after rejection. Angles add up, lines meet, and one day you can cross a room that used to feel impossible. She still had to move, still had to start over, but starting over no longer meant starting from nothing. The backpack was lighter now, not because she carried less, but because she carried better. When she looked at the page, she saw less of the girl who wrote it and more of the path it had cleared. And in that shift from identity to practice, she began to assemble materials of a future no one would grant and no one could revoke. If you've been taught to wait for permission, this is the part that changes everything. You can grant yourself a next hour. If any of this rings true, add your own note to this moment. Write in the comments, I'm on this journey too. 3 lines in pencil. No magic, just a short, direct map. The first line was about showing up every day, especially when no one asked and no one noticed. Ava called it the anchor hour. 60 minutes she owned before the world could ask for anything back. It wasn't a heroic sprint. It was a quiet appointment with the future she wanted. Some mornings it was vocabulary and a page of math. Other mornings it was a list of 5 people to call about odd jobs and 1 script she rehearsed in front of a mirror. She built non-negotiables so small they couldn't scare her. Minimum she could hit even on the worst days. Because consistency is more honest than intensity. If life in foster care taught her that stability can vanish overnight, discipline taught her that stability can be rebuilt in the morning. She tracked what she could count, not to impress anyone, but to witness cause and effect in her own hands. In a world that rewards spectacle, she learned to trust the quiet arithmetic of practice. The second line asked her to keep learning relentlessly and cheaply. She treated the library like a gym. Warm up with a chapter, heavy set with a skill, cool down by copying 1 paragraph to study the cadence of clear writing. She used a timer, so the work could outlast her moods, and she made peace with not understanding on the first pass. If a concept slid away, she chased it with questions, stacked examples, found a simpler source, then came back for another round. This wasn't about collecting motivational stories or binging inspiring stories as a substitute for effort. It was about turning real-life inspiration into repeatable technique. She built a notebook of patterns, how good introductions start, how strong emails close, how numbers tell a story, and she revisited those pages until the moves felt natural. She shadowed competence wherever she found it. A barista balancing a rush like a conductor, a nurse triaging chaos with calm, a neighbor pricing a garage sale by value instead of sentiment. The world is a live classroom if you decide to take notes. Now I want to go even deeper into this. The third line was the one that made adults raise eyebrows because it sounded too ambitious for a kid who kept clothes in a trash bag. Financial independence. But Ava didn't hear riches. She heard room. Independence meant time she didn't have to sell in a hurry. Choices she didn't have to beg for, and emergencies that didn't have to become disasters. She drew a simple picture. A jar for what she had to pay, a jar for what she chose to keep, and a jar for what would quietly grow. The first time she pulled in $20, she practiced the split. It was clumsy at first, but the ritual taught her a language of margins. She learned that money is a rhythm. Earn, hold, direct, not a mood. She studied basics the way you study a map. Cash flow before profit, cost before dreams, small experiments before big commitments. When a neighbor paid her to organize a closet, she wrote a tiny invoice by hand, not to play business but to respect the exchange. When a teacher let her help at a weekend event, she noticed which tasks were priced higher and why. She wasn't chasing a headline, orphan to millionaire. She was building the bones of success after rejection with choices that stacked. The clarity of the method gave her authority over a life that had too often been decided in rooms she couldn't enter. One line, one habit. One line, one skill. One line, one margin. In Rise Stories, emotional stories, we usually see the bright moment, the stage lights, the applause. Ava saw the plumbing. Routines that feed learning, learning that feeds opportunity, opportunity that feeds freedom. She built small systems that didn't depend on delicate conditions. If the morning was chaotic, she moved the anchor hour to the evening. If money was tight, she bartered time for knowledge. If fear shouted, she answered with a question on paper, and the next action she could do without asking permission. That's why her blueprint feels like true stories of perseverance. It survives ordinary chaos. It survives no-shows and flat tires and the kind of loneliness that makes you want to quit for the comfort of familiar failure. The lines held because they were shorter than her excuses. It's tempting to romanticize the grind, but her version was practical, not performative. She didn't post about it. She posted it on the calendar. She didn't aim for perfect. She aimed for repeatable. She asked, "What version of this can I do today if everything goes wrong?" Then she did that version and forgave the rest. Little by little, the effort created instruments she could play on command. A clean email that got replies, a 1-minute pitch that felt like a conversation, a budget that turned windfalls into stepping stones instead of souvenirs. And as she practiced, the world changed its response in small ways that mattered. A return call, an offer to assist, a referral said casually in a hallway. That's how stories of resilience and stories of overcoming rejection actually move. Not in a leap, but in measures that repeat until a door that used to be locked becomes just another handle you know how to try. When she looked back at the letter, the lines read the same, but they meant more. Discipline had turned from punishment into protection. Learning had turned from escape into expansion. Independence had turned from a wish into a structure. She was already standing inside. The map was short because the walk would be long, and she was okay with that. There's a strange freedom in knowing your part is small and clear. You stop bargaining with fate and start bargaining with the next hour. That's the texture behind success after rejection, the part of the orphan to millionaire arc that almost never makes a thumbnail, a person quietly refusing to outsource their future. The pencil marks faded a little where her thumb touched them every day, and that felt right too. A plan is supposed to live. It's supposed to show fingerprints. She didn't guard the page like a relic. She worked it like a tool, adding notes in the margin, crossing out what no longer fit, sharpening the 3 lines through repetition instead of revision. And as the world kept its weather, storms, calms, long gray stretches, she kept her climate, an hour she owned, a skill she was building, a margin she was widening. Her life didn't look different in a week, but felt different in a day. That feeling, more than the numbers, told her she was not waiting anymore. She was building. If this framework fits the shape of your own day, write in the comments. This makes sense to me. Before the sun, Ava chose effort over excuse, one step at a time. The house was still, the hallway clock a soft metronome, and the public library wouldn't open for hours, but her day had already started. She would sit on the edge of the bed with the letter unfolded across her knees, mouth the 3 lines like a pledge, then lace the promises into ordinary motions. 20 minutes of reading, 10 of notes, 5 of breath to steady the nerves that loved to sprint. After school came bikos, the small jobs that paid in cash and practice. Sweeping a stoop, organizing a closet, carrying boxes from a truck to a storage unit. None of it looked like destiny. It looked like a person stacking repeatable wins until they weighed more than the past. The library became her second address. When the doors slid open, she walked straight to the same table, because sameness is a gift when everything else moves. She checked out a biography and a basic manual, how to draft an email, how to keep a simple ledger, because inspiring stories are only useful if they turn into steps. She read fast, then reread slow. She copied a paragraph by hand to hear how clarity sounds. She watched how the librarians triage lines with kindness and precision, reminding herself that competence is a transferable language. She carried a notebook to collect patterns, prices for flyers at the print shop, what time the bus actually showed up, which neighbors paid on the day they promised, and which needed a reminder that sounded firm but not hard. She wasn't building a brand. She was building muscle memory. The habits were humble enough to survive a bad night of sleep and a surprise move. She designed them to be portable. If the kitchen was busy, she studied vocabulary on the stairs. If the Wi-Fi cut out, she wrote her pitch with a pencil, so she could memorize the bones of it. If a shift ran long, she trimmed the plan, not the principle. The anchor hour could be 20 minutes a day and still count, because consistency respects reality. That's the mathematics behind rise stories most people never see. The compounding of small acts, interest paid in quiet confidence. Each repetition made the next decision easier to choose. Each tiny proof shortened the distance between intention and action. The letter asked for that kind of proof, and she gave it the only way proof is ever given, again. Agora eu quero ir ainda mais profundo nesse assunto. Compounding didn't just change her results. It changed her identity cues. She stopped saying, "I'm trying," and started saying, "I'm the kind of person who shows up." Language anchored behavior. Behavior reinforced the language. The feedback loop was subtle. A teacher asked her to explain how she solved a problem. A neighbor recommended her to another neighbor. The bus driver nodded when she boarded because she boarded at the same time each day. Routine made her legible to the world, and the world, slowly, cautiously, responded. What she read fed what she practiced. Emotional stories were fuel when the house felt cold. Real-life inspiration gave her tactics when courage was enough. She copied the cadence of a good introduction until it lived in her voice. She learned to count backward from 10 when anxiety tried to flood her at a doorbell. She mapped the city not by landmarks, but by opportunities she could reach within 30 minutes. Motivational stories were nice. Methods were necessary. So she committed to minimum viable habits. 3 lines of gratitude in the margins when envy crept in, a glass of water before the pitch so her throat wouldn't betray her, a 2-sentence summary after every chapter so she remembered what she'd actually learned. None of it would trend, and that was the point. Quiet scales better than noise. After school, the BICO's sharpened skills a classroom couldn't grade. She learned how to estimate time without a clock, how to say, "I can do that," and then learn how by tonight, how to keep a promise even when it cost a bus fare she hadn't planned for. She watched the way people relax when you arrived 2 minutes early and cleaned the last corner without being asked. She saw that trust begins in details. A receipt written clearly, a text that says "on my way," a tone that makes the customer feel like the center, not the obstacle. These aren't headline moments and stories of resilience. They're the invisible stitches that keep the fabric from tearing when it stretches. The mornings with the letter weren't sentimental. They were strategic. She'd underline a word and then ask a question. Discipline. What does that look like at 6:10 a.m. when I don't want it? Learning. What skill pays twice, once today and once again next year? Independence. What tiny decision today makes future Ava safer? The questions reduce drama and raise clarity. When fatigue begged for permission to skip, she negotiated. Do the smallest faithful version, then stop. Surprisingly, stopping on purpose made it easier to start tomorrow. She became suspicious of extremes and loyal to rhythms, because success after rejection rarely comes from a single dramatic push. It arrives from true stories of perseverance arranged like bricks. She measured progress in controllables. Minutes read, emails sent, doors knocked. When results lagged, she refused a story that nothing worked and asked a better one. Which part didn't work yet? That yet kept her honest and generous at the same time. It let her believe in the slope, not the spike. Over months, the slope lifted her posture. She heard in the way she ordered at a counter, "Please, thank you, here's the exact cash." She saw in the manager's eyes when he said there was an opening on Saturdays and thought she might fit. The life she was rehearsing in small rooms started auditioning for bigger stages without her begging. She noticed a second compounding. Relationships. The librarian who held a book a day longer when she knew Ava would return it. The neighbor who said, "You're careful," and meant it as the highest compliment. The teacher who loaned a calculator and later wrote a reference. None of these were miracles. They were returns on reliability. They were the predictable dividends of showing up like clockwork, being easy to help, and making help matter by following through. In stories of overcoming rejection, this part gets edited out because it's not dramatic, but the quiet network is the bridge between orphan to millionaire, the infrastructure beneath the arc. By then, she had built a calendar that didn't care where she slept. Wake, read, note, move, work, review. The sequence was forgiving and firm. On good days, it carried her farther. On bad days, it carried her anyway. And a strange calm appeared. She no longer waited for permission from a house or a last name. The routine gave her something better, momentum that could survive rough handling. It was not happiness on demand. It was dignity on schedule. When the letter lay open now, the pencil lines looked thinner, but they cut deeper. She could feel the 3 promises under her day like studs under drywall. If someone had asked what was changing, she would have shrugged. Nothing to see, everything to feel. The present felt more navigable, the future less abstract. She had stopped bargaining with luck and started bargaining with the next hour, and the next hour kept saying yes. If this part resonates, write in the comments, 1 step at a time. The idea looked almost too small to matter. A neighbor's Saturday yard sale with piles of clothes and no system. Ava offered to sort, label, and stage the table so browsers could actually see what was there. She priced by pattern instead of sentiment, grouped by size, folded the denim into crisp stacks, and built a 3-4 rack to move the slow items. She made a 1-page flyer in the library using a free template, printed 5 copies, and promised a clean count and a handwritten tally at the end. When the neighbor hesitated, Ava quoted a flat fee and added something extra she could control. Clear signs, a donations box for leftovers, and a texted photo before and after. 2 hours later, the driveway looked like a store. The neighbor pressed the bill into her hand. It wasn't the amount, it was a validation. Someone paid for what she created. That first sale didn't change her bank account. It changed her posture. She walked home lighter, not because the cash was heavy, but because the doubts were. A micro win is a new lens. The world felt more legible, like price tags had appeared on effort. She wrote an invoice by hand, not to play office, but to prove to herself that value can be captured and counted. Then she split the money into jars where the letter said, pay, keep, grow, and felt the ritual steady her thinking. This is the part that emotional stories sometimes skip, the moment when a human being understands that a result can be produced on purpose. In rise stories and inspiring stories, the camera loves a big break. In real-life inspiration, the camera would have to love a yard sale. She treated the day like an experiment she could rerun. What actually worked? Signs that I level moved more items. Last 2 hours, discount cleared the stubborn pile. Greeting each visitor was simple. Let me know what you're hunting for. Sparked conversations that led to bundles. She scribbled these notes into the notebook that already held vocabulary lists and bus schedules, because business patterns deserve the same respect as school patterns. On Monday, she added a 1-sentence ad to a community board. Driveway sale staging, pricing, folding, signs, final tally, photos. The phone didn't ring, but a week later, a text arrived. A second neighbor. Another driveway. Another small success. And then a third. These weren't miracles. They were loops. The more she repeated, the clearer the loop became. Promise plainly. Show up early. Deliver exactly. Leave proof behind. The loop didn't care about her last name. It didn't care who had believed in her before noon. That's why stories of resilience feel simple when you look closely. They are built on loops that outlast moods. Each driveway taught her a bit more about margin and mercy. Mercy for the past, because she was learning late. Margin for the future, because every clean tally bought her a little more room. In motivational stories, we celebrate grit. In true stories of perseverance, we can name the steps grit actually takes. Agora eu quero ir ainda mais profundo nesse assunto. The validation shifted how she saw the letter's third line. Independence wasn't a fantasy. It was a series of choices that protected tomorrow. She created a tiny checklist so she could work without drama. Bring tape, bring markers, bring change, confirm start and end times the night before. She made a rate card not because anyone demanded it, but because she didn't want to haggle with nerves. She taught herself to ask one brave question at the end of each job. Is there anyone you know who's planning a sale next month? Referrals began to trickle, and trickles are how rivers start. This is success after rejection at its most unglamorous. A human being building a bridge made of yes small enough to carry. To keep herself honest, she logged the hours and the outcome. 3 hours, $52. For hours, $75. A rainy day that barely paid bus fare. She wrote what she would do differently next time and closed a notebook without verdicts. The practice wasn't a verdict machine. It was a compass. She learned to move through disappointment without absorbing it, whether on the skin, not a story in the bones. She learned to frame setbacks in the same plain language she used for wins. The signs were too small. The layout confused people. The discount came too late. The fewer excuses she allowed, the more control she felt. In stories of overcoming rejection, that's the quiet turn, when blame stops being a hobby and design becomes one. Not everything worked, and that helped. Failure taught her the edges of her offer. She tried adding baked goods once and realized she couldn't manage food and flow at the same time. She tried hourly pricing and switched back to flat fees because the math made clients relax. She learned to say, I don't do that, for tasks that didn't fit, hauling heavy furniture, selling online, then partner with a neighbor's teenage son who did. Coordination earns trust faster than bravado. The little enterprise stayed small on purpose, and that decision protected the rhythm she fought to build. Study, work, read, rest. She wasn't chasing the orphan to millionaire headline. She was building competence that could scale without breaking. One afternoon, a customer handed her a tip with a compliment that pierced deeper than the bill. You're careful, not talented, not special. Careful. She carried that word home like a new tool. Careful meant she could be trusted with things that matter to other people. Careful meant she could promise outcomes instead of effort. Careful meant she had a reputation forming, one receipt at a time. If you field test any of the great success arcs, the ones we file under inspiring stories, you find this word hiding underneath. Careful. It is the opposite of spectacle. It compels results. Ava adjusted her script again, this time to reflect who she was becoming. I can set up your sale and leave it ready for you to run, with clear prices and a final tally sheet. No superlatives, no fluff. When a client asked for proof, she had photos in her pocket. Before, after, the clipboard with numbers that told the truth. Proof moves strangers faster than charm. And proof is portable. Even if she moved houses tomorrow, the portfolio would move with her. The first micro-victory had taught her that money is a rhythm. The next few taught her that identity is one, too. She was no longer the girl who waited. She was a young woman who started, measured, and corrected. The work didn't make her loud. It made her steady. And steadiness is the plot twist that real-life inspiration rarely flaunts but always requires. One day bled into the next with fewer spikes and more slope, the kind of slope that turns into a horizon if you keep walking. If this chapter clicks with your own experience, write in the comments, "This makes sense to me." She met the mentor by accident, which is how most turning points introduce themselves. Quietly, as if nothing special were happening. The library had been crowded that afternoon, and Ava took the only open seat near the returns desk. A woman in a navy cardigan noticed the yard sale photos on Ava's phone and a notebook full of prices and times. "You organize sales?" the woman asked, not like a test, but like an invitation. Her name was Ms. Ellis, a librarian with a talent for making chaos line up into aisles. Ava nodded and explained what she did. Ms. Ellis listened to the whole answer without interrupting, then slid a single index card across the table. On it, 3 headings: weekly goals, pitch, follow-up. "Start here," she said. One right piece of advice at the right time turned a task into a target. Weekly goals sounded simple until Ms. Ellis made them specific enough to measure. 2 clients, 1 referral, 1 system improvement, she said. That's a week. Systems mattered more than sprints. Ava learned to design goals that didn't depend on luck, deliverables she could complete without waiting on someone else's mood. She built Monday check-ins with herself, Friday reckoning with numbers, and a Sunday reset that clarified what would count as progress. The clarity borrowed Ms. Ellis's calm. Goals stopped feeling like pressure and started feeling like permission, an agreement between present Ava and future Ava. In the great rise stories and emotional stories we love to share, the mentor often appears with a key. Ms. Ellis appeared with a calendar and a pencil sharpener. Next came the pitch. Ava's old approach was honest but scattered. "I can help set up your sale," she would say, then rush to fill the silence. Ms. Ellis taught her the rhythm of a clean offer: value, process, proof. "I stage yard sales so buyers can see value fast. I handle grouping, pricing, and signs, and I leave you a final tally sheet with photos. Here are 3 before and afters. No adjectives doing push-ups, just a straight line from problem to outcome." They practiced in the stacks between biographies and business, because the air there felt like real-life inspiration, ordinary, breathable, patient. Ava learned to keep her voice low and her verb strong. The first time she used a new pitch, the client agreed in 30 seconds. Authority, it turns out, sound like brevity. Follow-up completed the loop. "Most people never follow up," Ms. Ellis said, "and that's where opportunity hibernates." Ava wrote a 72-hour rule on a yellow sticky note. Confirm dates within a day, send photos within 2, ask for a referral within 3. She kept a little ledger of names and details, dogs' names, street numbers, the color of the mailbox, because remembering made strangers feel seen, and feeling seen turns into trust. Follow-up transforms single jobs into a sequence. In motivational stories, we tend to applaud grit. In true stories of perseverance, we document cadence. Ms. Ellis wasn't a fairy godmother. She was a trainer. She watched how Ava worked and trimmed what wasted motion. "You apologize too much," she observed, not unkindly. Trade apologies for clarity. Ask questions that move the job forward. She nudged Ava to test price anchors, to pre-cut sign shapes so setup ran smoother, to define a good job before the job began. The tweaks were small and surgical, but they compounded the way all inspiring stories do when you stop guessing and start measuring. Each week looked a little more like a system, and systems scale character before they scale revenue. Agora eu quero ir ainda mais profundo nesse assunto. Ms. Ellis introduced reading like a blueprint, not a hobby. "You're not collecting quotes," she said. "You're stealing procedures." Together, they broke down a chapter on negotiation into sentences Ava could actually use on a porch at 7 a.m. They studied a page on time blocking and carved out a 2-hour deep work block for pricing. The phones face down, the world on hold. They read a case study and extracted a question Ava would ask every client. "What would success look like for you by 2 p.m.? Strategic reading turned the library into a lab. Ava stopped treating books as pep talks and started treating them as toolboxes, each with a wrench she could pocket for the next job. The results didn't explode. They accumulated. A client texted, "The layout helped us sell out kids' clothes by noon." Another left a voicemail, voice warm. "You made this easy." A local community group asked if she could prep 3 fundraising tables. None of it looked like a movie montage. It looked like a young woman applying small pieces of precise advice until the world adjusted its response. This is the shape of stories of resilience and stories of overcoming rejection that actually hold up progress that is not loud but undeniable. Success after rejection doesn't knock like a parade. It taps like a metronome. With every week, Ava's confidence changed tone. It wasn't louder, it was cleaner. She could explain her work in one breath and let the silence do its job. She could price without flinching because she could point to the system behind the number. And she could leave each driveway with evidence. Photos, a tally, a referral name. Evidence travels better than hope. Evidence is what carries an orphan to millionaire arc from legend to logistics. The phrase sounds grand, but underneath it lives an accumulation of disciplined, almost boring choices set in motion by a mentor who saw a worker and decided to make her work easier to scale. One afternoon, between returns and a squeaky book cart, Ms. Ellis handed Ava a fresh index card. "Next layer," she said. "Standard operating notes." It was a page of micro-checklists and if-then lines. If rain, shift tables a garage. If no clothing racks, build one with rope and 2 ladders. If foot traffic slows, move the sign to the corner and add an arrow. The card looked plain. The effect was not. It turned problems into prompts and accidents into procedures. Ava felt a new steadiness come online, the kind you get when contingency isn't catastrophe, just choreography. That steadiness is the unglamorous heartbeat of inspiring stories and real-life inspiration alike. The last gift Ms. Ellis gave her wasn't a tactic. It was a sentence. "You are not asking for favors," she said, leaning in. "You are offering outcomes." Ava copied it at the top of her notebook in neat letters. The words reset her posture again. Offering outcomes meant she could stand level with any client, any room, any schedule. It meant she could say no to misfit work without apology, and yes to bigger puzzles without panic. It meant the future didn't feel like a secret anymore. It felt like a sequence. If this moment speaks to you, add a note in the comments that says, "Right advice, right time." It happened on a Saturday that should have been simple. 3 driveways, staggered by time, clear weather on the forecast. By noon, a gust of wind tipped the clothing racks at the second house. 2 tumbled. Hangers snapped. A pile of dresses landed in a muddy strip by the curb. While she scrambled with towels and apologies, the first client texted that the tally didn't match the cash box. At the 3rd driveway, a volunteer put new stickers over her clean price tags to make them round numbers, undoing an hour of layout in 5 minutes. The day frayed fast. She finished late, left photos, rechecked the math, and walked home with damp cuffs and a headache that made the streetlights look like halos. On the neighborhood forum that night, a post appeared. "Mixed experience with sale organizer, professional but overbooked." It wasn't cruel, but it was public. It felt like a no in front of a room that had just turned to watch. The next morning, she woke with the aftertaste of failure. When you don't have much margin, a bad day feels like a verdict. She replayed the whole loop: wind, towels, stickers, box, receipt, until the edges cut. The phone was quiet. She pictured Ms. Ellis's index cards and felt a flash of irritation at how tidy they were compared to real life. She almost put the notebook in a drawer, the universal gesture for later, which is how never dresses when it wants to look reasonable. Instead, she pulled out the letter, creased along the familiar fold. The paper was wrinkled. The words were not. The circled line didn't flatter her or minimize the mess. It simply named the next hour. And naming the next hour was the opposite of quitting. She started with an apology that wasn't an autobiography. To the first client, "You were right about the cash mismatch. I double-counted a stack and corrected the tally. New sheet attached. I've added a cross-check step, so this doesn't repeat." To the forum commenter, "Thank you for candid note. I overstacked my day. I'm moving to a 2 sale max and adding a weather plan, portable garment weights, and pre-cut ties. Clarity, then a change. No panic discounts. No pleading." If emotional stories are the spark that gets us to care, then true stories of perseverance are the blueprint that keeps us building. She decided to treat the bad day like a lab report. Results, variables, adjustments. By afternoon, she was in the library with Ms. Ellis, who didn't rescue or scold. She pointed to the sequence on the index card and drew tiny boxes in the margins. "Redesign your capacity. Stress test each box." Together they ran if-then drills until contingency lost its teeth. If wind, tie backdrops to the fence. If volunteers arrive, give them one job and a label. If a box of cash exists, you count, they verify, then both sign. Bored by her own embarrassment, Ava laughed once, soft, unexpected, and felt the laugh make room for breath. In inspiring stories, we love the one-liner that turns the tide. In real-life inspiration, it's usually a checklist that does the turning. Agora eu quero ir ainda mais profundo nesse assunto. The hardest part wasn't the weather plan or the math. It was a sound in her head that said, "See, you got lucky a few times, and here's the truth. Stories of overcoming rejection don't erase that voice. They teach you to take away its microphone." She wrote a line under the circled sentence in the letter. 1 hour of repair beats 1 day of regret. Then she practiced something very small. Taping price signs faster without bubbles, aligning the arrow at the exact angle that caught the corner driver's eye. It felt too trivial to matter until she remembered how compounding works. Trivial is the raw material of inevitable. The calls didn't come back right away. The forum posted its quiet damage, and she lived under it. She did one pro bono setup for a local fundraiser because making something orderly still felt like medicine. She sent a private note to the volunteer who had restickered the tags. No hard feelings. Next time I'll mark sections so we don't duplicate effort. That line cost pride and bought peace. The following week, a past client messaged her, saw the thread. I commented about our good experience. You free next Saturday. Good reputation is slow. Bad reputation feels instant. Neither is total. The slope still exists under the noise. She upgraded small tools. Binder clips for wind. A belt bag for cash. A tiny scale for pricing small items fairly. She printed a process sheet so clients could see how the day would move, then invited them to add constraints she could plan around. No selling heirlooms. Stop at 2 p.m. no matter what. Donate children's books only. The sheet cut friction in half. It also changed how she felt at the curb. She wasn't begging for grace. She was offering outcomes with diagram. In Rise Stories, we emphasize fate. She was engineering odds. The follow-up after the next job was uneventful, which is a victory the internet never celebrates. Tally matched. Photos sent. A referral offered without request. She noticed how an ordinary good day now felt like recovery, not luck. The bad Saturday remained in the notebook, annotated in the same pen as the wins. It had a place. It didn't get a throne. Success after rejection needs that posture. Acknowledge the bruise. Keep the stance. The paper is wrinkled. The words are not. She wrote again, smaller, like a stitch. There were more setbacks. One client canceled the morning of. Another tried to renegotiate payment after the tables were staged, but the floor inside her had been reinforced. When she said no, it was not anger, it was policy. When she redesigned a step, it wasn't chasing perfection. It was respect for the work. As the system grew thicker, the story grew quieter, and quiet was good. Quiet is where the momentum lives. Quiet is what turns an orphan to millionaire arc from slogan into a stack of Tuesdays. The forum thread eventually sank under newer posts. The librarian's index cards multiplied and moved to a slim binder. The letter stayed where it had always been, creased and steady. The lines circled in pencil had less to do with destiny than with direction. Take the next faithful action and let it teach you the one after. That sounded plain until she felt its power. It meant she could fail in public without forfeiting her private compass. It meant today's dent didn't own tomorrow's door. If this piece of the journey lands for you, write in the comments. Words, not wrinkles. She registered the name on a gray Tuesday, the kind of day that doesn't look like a milestone until you see what grows from it. An LLC, a tax ID, a bank account that didn't share space with bus fares or borrowed lunches. She bought a simple domain and put up a one-page site with 3 clear promises, staging, pricing, proof, and a gallery of before and after photos that did the persuading. Packages replace hunches. Starter for small driveways, standard for family sales, Fundraiser Pro with volunteer briefings and a donation lane. She wrote a cancellation policy in plain English and a weather plan in bold. The forms were short, the expectations shorter. She stopped chasing luck and started measuring progress. The spreadsheet became the nerve center. Name, date, address, package source, price, hours, referral, next action, follow-up date, notes. She tracked conversion rate from inquiry to book job, average ticket, repeat rate, and a simple satisfaction score. Would you hire me again? Collected by text the next morning. Numbers weren't the point, but they kept her honest. If average setup time dropped from 80 minutes to 60, she wanted to know why so she could keep it. If a busy Saturday left errors in the tally, she wanted to see the signal and fix the step. The enterprise was still small enough to fit in a backpack, but the thinking had widened. Process gave her authority she didn't need to borrow. She tuned the offer the way you tune an instrument. Pricing stabilized around value, not panic. The last 2 hours, discount moved stubborn inventory. A bundled kids zone cleared tiny clothes fast and made space for bigger ticket items. She stocked a kit that looked like a carpenter's but spoke retail. Rope, ladder clamps, pre-cut sign arrows, garment weights, binder clips, a tiny scale, fresh markers, and a foldable checklist. She trained 2 reliable helpers with Ms. Ellis's index cards expanded into a 3-page playbook. Setup order, signage placements, cash handling protocol, client briefing questions. Helpers weren't there to help. They owned sections. Responsibility made people sharper. Roles made days smoother. Online brought a different quiet power. Clients would see the calendar and pick a slot without 10 back-and-forth messages. Testimonials were short and concrete. Sold kids' clothes by noon, clear tally sheet final cash match, made a fundraiser feel professional. She didn't sweeten them. She let their brevity carry weight. On the site, she added a microblog with simple, practical posts, how to sort by category in 30 minutes, the best time to place the arrow sign, why flat surfaces matter more than fancy racks. The posts weren't written for algorithms. They were written for neighbors, and that paradox made them persuasive. Agora eu quero ir ainda mais profundo nesse assunto. Formalization changed the way she felt in her own work. Separating accounts turned decisions from emotional to operational. She could look at the month and see capacity instead of chaos. She could say no without guilt because the calendar said no first. She mapped her costs, transport, printing supplies, and saw where dollars leaked. She patched the leaks not with frugality theater, but with precision. Bulk packs of markers, reusable signs, a laminator that paid for itself in one windy week. The pay, keep, grow, jars became budget lines. Expenses, owners pay, retained earnings. Independence, once a concept, had line items. She noticed a niche forming inside the niche. Estate cleanouts needed gentler language and a different pace. School fundraisers needed crowd flow and a cheerful microphone. Moving sales wanted speed and a clear must-go section. She made small templates for each, not to look sophisticated, but to think faster under pressure. The template stabilized the experience for clients who were often stressed or sad or hurried. The work became more than order. It became hospitality with a ledger. This is how the rise stories look in the engine room. Unglamorous refinements, 1,000 tiny decisions turning into one obvious reputation. The emotional stories we love to hear only last because there's a system underneath. The inspiring stories that move us only matter if they become repeatable. Real-life inspiration is what you can redo on a bad day. Motivational stories light the match. Processes keep the stove on. These are the stories of resilience you rarely see in a montage. The stories of overcoming rejection written in bulletproof small print. It is an orphan to millionaire, arc translated from slogan to schedule, success after rejection audited by a spreadsheet. True stories of perseverance rendered as calendar blocks that hold. The numbers began to tell a steadier tale. Booked jobs per month ticked from 3 to 5 to 8. Average ticket rose when she named the value and stuck to it. Repeat rate grew because the follow-up made future Ava easier to hire. She set a threshold for help. Any day with 2 jobs required both assistants, no exceptions. She retired the belt bag for a lockbox and created a 2-person count with signatures. Friction fell. Trust climbed. She didn't get louder. She got clearer with the binder in her backpack and the site doing first introductions. Ava started to see energy return to her in new forms. A small nonprofit asked for a multi-table layout for a weekend drive. A local church booked her for a yearly sale. A realtor offered a pilot. Stage client downsizes in exchange for referrals. None of it felt like a leap. It felt like the next logical square. The company didn't announce itself with ribbon cutting. It revealed itself every time the process worked without drama. She could have called it humble, but humble wasn't the point. Honest was. She learned to leave space in the schedule on purpose, to absorb the life that will always happen. The gaps made her sharper when she needed to be, and kinder when people were fragile. Authority by process didn't mean armor. It meant latitude. When a client cried over a box of baby shoes, the timeline stretched. When thunder rolled in at noon, the weather plan unfolded like choreography. The machine and the human didn't fight. They took turns. From a distance, The business looked like organized tables and neat signs. Up close, it was a young woman who no longer waited for good days to choose her. She chose a day and gave it a job. The letter's 3 lines had become a living architecture. Discipline laid the foundation. Learning wired the rooms. Independence paid the bills and kept the light steady. The house wasn't finished. Houses never are. But the frame held, and frames, more than paint, carry weight. If this part resonates, write in the comments, measuring progress. She didn't hear it as a drum roll. It arrived like most of her best days. Quiet and on schedule. An ordinary evening. A clean desk. The binder opened a month, the spreadsheet waiting. She entered 3 numbers from the last job. The formulas did their work, and the total nudged past a line she had once written on the inside cover of a notebook. Cumulative revenue, $1 million. No confetti, no speech, no audience, just a closed laptop, a long exhale, and the letter, creased, steady, resting where it had always rested. No fireworks. A spreadsheet closed, a small smile, and a promise kept. What mattered wasn't the comma in the number. It was the rhythm that had carried her there. Conversion rate held at a quiet 51%. Repeat clients at 34%. Refunds near 0 because the scope was clear on paper and kinder in person. The assistant's hours stabilized. Bills were paid before worry could get loud. The retained earnings line in the ledger finally looked like the room she had defined years ago. People love rise stories with brass bands and bright lights. But the orphan to millionaire reality unfolded like a metronome. The same loop held over seasons until the world had to admit that consistency itself is a kind of brilliance. She did mark the moment, but she did it operationally. The business funded a weather kit upgrade for the team, 2 paid training days, and a micro scholarship to cover exam fees for 3 youth aging out of foster care. The caption on the transfer read, simply, to make tomorrow easier than today. Emotional stories often end with a finish line. Hers deepened into a lane. The first million wasn't an ending. It was a calibration. It proved that systems she could run on a bad day could also scale on a good month. It proved that success after rejection doesn't need to look like revenge to be real. It can look like relief. Bills auto-paid. Schedules predictable. Choices no longer rented by the hour. Agora eu quero ir ainda mais profundo nesse assunto. Money didn't erase the past, but altered the temperature of the rooms she walked into. Cash flow freed attention. With a cushion in place, she stopped overbooking out of fear and started over-delivering on purpose. She could say no to misfit work without flinching because policy said it first. She could give a sick day without panic because the calendar could carry it. Independence sounded less like wealth than like oxygen. That's the part most inspiring stories leave vague. The way optionality changes your posture. When you don't have to panic, you can plan. When you don't have to beg, you can design. The arc from stories of overcoming rejection to stories of resilience is paved with small, boring forms that make life gentler for everyone involved. What did the million mean to Ava personally? Not a car, not a watch. It meant she slept. It meant she could take a Tuesday afternoon to sit with Ms. Ellis in the quiet between the stacks and map a next layer without a knot in her stomach. It meant the jar label grow in her childhood shorthand, now translated to real allocations. Equipment that saves time, software that saves mistakes, counsel that saves confusion. Real-life inspiration is not the moment of applause. It's the moment a worker gets to choose a better tool and comes home less exhausted. It's less cinematic and more humane. If you peel back the number, here's what you'd see. Helpers whose rent became reliably paid because their hours became reliably available. A circle of neighbors who started timing their moves and fundraisers around her calendar because trust has a texture you can plan around. A teacher who asked her to speak to a class. Not about hustle, but about process. Motivational stories have their place. They light a match. But in the ledger of true stories of perseverance, the sustained burn belongs to checklists and kindness delivered on time. She took a thin black pen and added a new column to the spreadsheet. Impact notes. Not for marketing. No one would read it but her. But because she wanted to track the human returns the way she tracked cash. Mrs. Alvarez cried happy when the books found a new school. Lewis learned tallying, got hired for Saturdays. 2 clients referred each other. They kept our sign for next year. Numbers earned their dignity by holding feelings without drama. The notes became a counterweight to noise, a private ledger of why the work mattered on days when spreadsheets alone couldn't say it. The phrase orphan to millionaire will always attract eyes, but inside the story she was living, the label felt too small. She wasn't the sum of pity and profit. She was a professional who had built a language of reliability so fluent it read as calm. And calm, she learned, is persuasive. Calm reassures a client whose life is in boxes. Calm trains a team to solve instead of spiral. Calm is contagious. This, too, is success after rejection. Not shouting, finally, to be believed, but speaking plainly and being trusted because the evidence is habitual. The letter didn't change. She did. Discipline, learning, independence. 3 lines that had outlasted a dozen addresses and every story someone else tried to write for her. Now those lines funded internships, quiet donations to the library that had lent her its air, and a contingency fund for the kind of emergencies that once threatened to end the month. Quiet impact scales. It also steadies. And steadiness turns a million from a peak into a plateau you can build on. She met Ms. Ellis at closing time and showed her the binder like a child shows a drawing. The librarian smiled the way librarians do, pleased without surprise, and asked the only question that mattered. What stayed true? Ava tapped the letter. I did. The answer wasn't humility theater. It was logistics. She had kept the promises long enough for them to keep her back. That loop is a hidden heartbeat of the inspiring stories we admire and the rise stories we replay. Repetition that accumulates into identity. There will be new pressures, bigger clients, more variables, unexpected slow weeks. But the frame held, because the million didn't crown her. It clarified her. It said, the same move that worked then will work now if you protect them. And what you add should serve the moves, not smother them. From the outside, it might look like fortune finally arrived. From the inside, the truth was simpler. The next hour said yes, again. If this meaning of the milestone matches your gut, write in the comments. Quiet milestone. She didn't hang the frame like a trophy. She placed it where she could see it on difficult mornings, the way a runner sets shoes by the door. The letter's creases looked like small roads across the paper, and the pencil had softened in places where her thumb had pressed over the years. Under glass, it wasn't precious. It was practical. The original operating manual. The day she mounted it. She sent a quiet transfer to the library fund with no note, only the subject line, for more chairs and longer hours, because that room had loaned her air when she couldn't afford her own. Then she drafted a second note, this time to Ms. Ellis, asking for an hour after closing to sketch a program that did for others what a few index cards had done for her, turned drifting effort into repeatable outcomes. Legacy for Ava wasn't applause. It was architecture other people could stand inside. She started with small mentorship circles on Tuesday evenings. 6 teenagers from foster homes and transitional housing. 2 hours, snacks on the table, phones face down by choice, not decree. The first 10 minutes were for check-ins that didn't require confessions. The next 40 were skill drills that belong to ordinary life, but rarely get taught. How to write a 1-paragraph pitch that feels like a conversation. How to ask for clarification without apologizing. How to set one measurable weekly goal and close the loop with follow-up. She brought her playbooks, not to impress them with systems, but to show that even rise stories are built from plain tools. They read a page together and turned it into a worksheet. They practiced a script until it sounded like them. They wrote their own letters, short, direct, no magic, to their future selves. Emotional stories were welcome, but the room was not therapy. It was training. You could feel the difference in their shoulders when the pencil moved from describing pain to designing steps. Agora eu quero ir ainda mais profundo nesse assunto. She added micro-scholarships that didn't look like scholarships. Test fees, work shoes, a bus pass for a month, a locker rental, so someone could stop carrying everything all day. Impact had to be specific, measurable, and delivered fast enough to change this week. She partnered with Community Center to create anchor hours on Saturday mornings, quiet tables, loaner headphones, a whiteboard with 3 prompts. What did you keep? What did you learn? What did you build? The questions echoed her own letter: discipline, learning, independence. They didn't ask for life stories. They asked for evidence. This was real-life inspiration in its plainest form, the kind of inspiring stories that hold up because they are less about fireworks and more about fixtures. Some nights, the group broke into pairs and shadowed competency in the wild. A deli line where a manager orchestrated chaos in the flow, a thrift store where pricing was a language, the post office at 4:45 p.m. when everyone's patience thinned and the best clerk kept calm like a craft. They'd come back with notes, not quotes, and convert what they saw into checklists. Motivational stories still mattered. They lit sparks, but the room's energy turned when sparks found kindling: scripts, calendars, templates. These were stories of resilience you could run tomorrow and again next week. Stories of overcoming rejection that didn't require revenge to feel satisfying, only competence delivered on time. Ava kept a ledger for program the way she kept one for her company: names, contact times, small wins, next actions, because authority grows where accountability lives. When a teen messaged her, I asked for clarification instead of pretending. It went in the ledger. When another said, got my first paid Saturday, ledger. She watched their language shift from I hope to I plan to I did, the same progression that had moved her from orphan to millionaire in the public imagination, but privately, from chaos to cadence. It was success after rejection measured not in headlines, but in rent paid on time and a face a little looser around the eyes. Ms. Ellis insisted the program include a return loop. Give them chances to teach, she said, which sounded premature until it worked. A mentee would demo a checklist they refined on the job: how to prep a room service cart fast without waste, how to greet customers so lines move, and the room would write down what translated. Authority passed from mentor to peer like a steady flame. Ava remembered the librarian's first card: weekly goals, pitch, follow-up, and smiled at how those 3 boxes had turned into a ladder strong enough to hold other people's beginnings. The frame on the wall kept her honest. On days when money tempted her to scale past reason, the letter asked whether the process would survive a bad week. On days when weariness whispered that none of this changed much, the letter asked for a single name and a next hour. Legacy didn't need to look grand to be real. It looked like a grocery gift card handed with dignity. It looked like a calendar reminder that turned into a habit. It looked like a laminated sheet that reduced panic in the presence of authority. The best inspiring stories, she was learning, often hide in paperwork that works. She designed a first jobs kit that fit in a clear pouch, a simple time blocking card, a script for calling in sick without burning bridges, a micro budget that made the first paycheck last longer than 3 days, a permission slip to take notes at work and ask one improvement question a week. Employers noticed a difference. A supervisor emailed to say, whoever taught these kids to follow up, thank you. Ava wrote back that no one had taught them magic, only gears. True stories of perseverance are gear stories: what meshes with what and why. And she kept making private repairs to the past. A portion of her retained earnings auto-transferred each month to a small emergency fund earmarked for Ments, governed by plain criteria and fast yes/no decisions. No essays, no auditions. Need, check disburse receipt. Bureaucracy can feel like rejection in slow motion. Her program had to move faster than shame. When people asked her to speak on panels about rise stories or the orphan to millionaire arc, she accepted if there was a workshop attached, because speaking without tools felt like dessert without dinner. Ava knew not everyone wanted her kind of life. Legacy didn't mean manufacturing copies of herself. It meant multiplying options. Some men wanted college, some a trade, some just a place to exhale for a season. The frame on the wall, with its 3 quiet lines, gave all of them a way to measure a day that didn't bow to mood or memory. That was her return. Not money handed out like confetti, but a map returned to the drawer it came from, now dog-eared and usable. When she and Ms. Ellis locked up after session, they'd walk the stacks and talk about what stayed true. Clarity, brevity, follow-through. The same elements that built her business were building a small, sturdy community. The world still had weather. The work still had a climate. And as the program found its pace, Ava realized the letter had changed roles. It was no longer just a compass. It was a relay baton. She could pass the habit and watch it run. If this vision of legacy feels like the kind of ending you want to write for yourself, drop in the comments, "I'm writing the ending." If you've made it this far, you know why one simple letter could change an entire life. If today's story helped you see your next step a little more clearly, subscribe. That's how I keep bringing real tools and true comeback stories that actually help in the day-to-day. And so I know you were with me to the last frame. Drop this in the comments. I'm with you till the end. If something here landed for you, a like goes a long way. It tells the platform this message matters and helps it reach who needs it. There's a video right here that complements this one. Click it and keep going with me there.